This is Tuesday of the 30th week in Ordinary Time. Today's Gospel from Luke has Jesus telling his followers two parables, the parable of the mustard seed and that of the yeast the woman mixes to leaven the dough. Let me read them as found in the 13th chapter of Luke. Jesus said, "What is the kingdom of God like? To what can I compare it? It is like a mustard seed that a man took and planted in the garden. When it was fully grown, it became a large bush, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches." And again he said, "To what shall I compare the kingdom of God? It is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in 3 measures of wheat flour until the whole batch of dough was leavened." I'd like to focus on the parable of the mustard seed because I, perhaps like you, have heard this parable so often over the years that I do not take time to reflect on it. And I ask myself, what can this parable mean for us now? The parable of the mustard seed is also found in Matthew and Mark. Matthew adds a detail, it becomes a large bush. And Mark adds, "But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants and puts forth large branches." When I was bird watching in northern India, I couldn't help thinking of this parable as I looked at mile upon mile of mustard plants in bloom. As we went over each rise on the road, another vista of yellow mustard flowers met my eye. And I couldn't help but think of the small seed which produced these large plants. Unlike some of Jesus' other parables, which he had to explain to his listeners, he gives no explanation for this one. So we might presume the mustard tree or plant was well known to his listeners. Botanists seem to feel that the mustard seed in question is the black mustard plant, characterized by a very small seed and also characterized by rapid growth into a large-size herb the size of a tree. Probably not large enough to sustain nest building, but certainly large enough to give birds shelter. Jesus seems to be focused on the smallness of the seed, similar to some of his other parables on the kingdom of God, focusing on smallness growing into greatness. For example, the small amount of yeast to leaven a whole loaf, a pearl of great price, salt, light on top of a mountain. So what then are we to make our own from the mustard seed parable? Do you ever wonder, as I do frequently in these challenging times, what part we can play to bring forth the kingdom of God? Maybe this is not the case for those in a position of influence in our country, our church, or in our world, those who can play a large part in affecting change, hopefully to the benefit of the poor, the disenfranchised, immigrants, people of color, and even to overcoming our current pandemic. Maybe for these it's apparent what they have to offer. But what about us? People who care, who pray, but are not able to see a significant personal impact on these problems. There seem to me to be at least 2 important implications for us in this parable. First, however small we feel our contribution may be, we are invited to grow the kingdom. Maybe it's the support that we give to a friend, family member, colleague. Maybe it's putting aside our own plans for someone else's. Maybe it's a masked crinkle of the eyes to a worker or a stranger. We may not see the impact of our outreach, but we're invited to believe that God will use our smallest effort to advance the kingdom of God. Secondly, I think that we are invited to believe and trust that God can and will make use of our small contributions. and that each of our seemingly insignificant efforts to advance the kingdom will indeed bear fruit, whether apparent to our eye or not. For me, this is the most difficult challenge. It's not that we have not heard this multiple times, but rather, can we believe and trust without seeing the results? That, it seems to me, is our challenge, particularly in these unsettling times. The belief that our own actions, however small they may seem, can contribute to the growth of God's kingdom can be empowering. Voting, trying to at least understand the effects of systemic racism, following pandemic health reminders, the many mustard seeds we have available to ourselves to enable us to build God's kingdom. In the words of Gerard Manley Hopkins, that makes all our goings graces. May our faith and our own contributions to God's kingdom, small as they may seem, continue to grow as we seek to love and serve the Lord in our daily lives.